We continue now at the top of Daf Yomi Beis in Mesechet Yevamos. This is Yevamos 70b. The Gemara wants to know about the Toshav and Sacher that is written when it comes to Karban Pesach, and the Gemara says it can't be the Toshav and Sacher means an Eved Ivri, because an Eved Ivri shouldn't be pater from Karban Pesach, because on the contrary, by Truma we see that if you have an Eved Ivri, the Eved Ivri of the Kohen is not allowed to eat Truma. Alma lo kani le Rabbi, you say that there's no real kinyan, the master doesn't have a real kinyan, doesn't change the status of the Eved Ivri, he's like a regular Jew. So hachanami lo kani le Rabbi, here also when it comes to Karban Pesach, the master won't acquire him, meaning acquire his guf, he's still going to have the same status as a regular Jew, and of course he's going to be chayiv in Karban Pesach. So therefore that can't be what it means. So elalafnuye, so it must be that pasuk is just there to be freed up to be used for a gzeira shava. And Rashi over here explains, hachanami lo kani, here also the Eved Ivri is not going to be acquired gufe l'rabbe, his guf is not going to be acquired by the master. V'Yisrael malyo, he's obviously a regular Yisrael, v'chayiv b'Pesach, he's obviously chayiv in Karban Pesach, so again, that's why it's freed up to be used for the gzeira shava. But the Gemara continues, vakati, but still, mufna mitzad echru, that only means it's mufna from one side, meaning the Toshav and Sacher that are written by Karban Pesach, those are available for your gzeira shava, but the Toshav and Sacher that was written by Truma, that actually was required, as we said earlier. So therefore, it's only freed up on one side of the gzeira shava. V'shamin on leila Rabbi Eliezer, and we understand according to Rabbi Eliezer has said, the Amar, he happens to hold, he says, mufna mitzad echad, that when it comes to a situation of a gzeira shava, we're only on one side of the gzeira shava, the words are free to be used for the limud. L'meidin u'meshivin, you're allowed to learn such a gzeira shava, but you're also allowed to refute such a gzeira shava. So it still doesn't help us because it's only mufna mitzad echad. So how do we make this gzeira shava of Toshav v'Sacher again from Karban Pesach to Truma to teach us that an oral can't have Truma? We should be able to refute this gzeira shava. And so the Gemara answers, Kevan de lagufe lo tzarech, since the Toshav and Sacher that are written by Karban Pesach aren't needed at all when it comes to Karban Pesach. As Rashi over here says, Kevan de lagufe lo tzarech lo Toshav lo Sacher, you don't need the Toshav or Sacher by Karban Pesach at all. De lo evsher lo kaminu kipashtayu, you cannot even learn it according to the Pashup Pshat, even if you wanted to, because as we said, an Eved Ivri is actually chayiv in Karban Pesach. Klal, there's no way to use these words at all. Havale trei kra yisera, that's actually considered like two extra psukim, and therefore, as the Gemara continues, Shadi Chad Alomed v'Shadi Chad Amalamed. You take you have two words over here, Toshav and Sacher. Take one and throw it on that which is being learned to, and take one and throw it on that which is doing the teaching being learned from. V'Havale Gzeira Shava Mufna Mishnei Tzad, and it actually can be considered a Gzeira Shava that is free on both sides. As Rashi over here says, Shadi Chad Alomed v'Chad Amalamed u'Mufna Mishnei Tzadim Divrei Hakol L'Meidin Vein Meshiv. And everybody agrees if it's free on both sides, you can learn the Gzeira Shava, you can't refute it. Afilu Yesh Even if you have a logical refutation, you can still learn the Gzeira Shava. But the Gemara continues, if you have this Gzeira Shava of Toshav v'Sacher and you're learning from Karban Pesach to Truma, so why don't we learn the following halacha? Ima Pesach onen aser bo. When it comes to Karban Pesach, an onen is aser to have Karban Pesach. Rashi over here says, the alfinu lekulu kachim kal v'chomer m'maiser. We learn that out by all kachim, that an onen cannot have kachim. So av Truma onen aser bo, maybe we should say the same thing, that Truma also an onen should be aser to have Truma. And so to that the Gemara says, Amar Rav Yossi Bar Chanina, Amar Kra, Rav Yossi Bar Chanina says, because the pasuk says v'chol zar, it says that the zar can't have truma. Zaros amarti lach, we learn a zar cannot have truma. V'lo aninos, but that does not apply to an onen. The Gemara says, Ema v'lo arelos. Why not say that doesn't apply to an orel? Say a zar can't have truma, but an orel could have truma. Why say that an onen is the one that's allowed to have truma? And to that the Gemara says, Haksiv Toshav v'Sacher. No, we already have Toshav v'Sacher. That comes to say that there's somebody that can't have truma, and that must be the orel. And so the Gemara says, Umarois, and how do you know which one to say is a problem to have truma and which one is not a problem? The Gemara says, Mistabra arelos havalei l'rebuye. It makes more sense to say that the orel is the one included, meaning the orel is the one that cannot have truma. Why? Shekein mechusar maisa umaisa begufo, because the orel is missing an action. He has to actually be circumcised, and it's something that he's missing on his actual body. V'yonesh kares, and it's very strict. The punishment is kares for not having bris milah. V'yeshno lifnei hadibur. Also, bris milah was commanded before Matan Torah. There was already a mitzvah bris milah. Umila zechar of avad of makeves, and also when it comes to circumcision, you have to circumcise the males and the servants of the family. That's ma'akev in order to have Karban Pesach. Again, it's something that's stricter, so therefore it makes sense that you apply that to truma as well, and you say an orel cannot have truma. But the Gemara says, Adarab, on the contrary, Aninos Havalei L'Rebuya, maybe we should include an onen. and say an onen cannot have truma. Why? Shekain yeshna b'chol because an onen can happen at all times. Anytime it's possible somebody's going to die and someone will become an onen. V'noheges ba'anoshim v'noshim, and it's also something that applies to men and women. Obviously, mila only applies to men. Ve'in biyado l'saken esatzmo, also by an onen, he can't fix himself. When it comes to an oral, he can fix himself if he gets a bris milah. So you also have certain qualities, certain strengths by anina. So again, maybe that's the person that should not be allowed to have truma. And the Gemara answers to that, Hanach nefisha. No, the things that we listed when it came to oral were more. There were more of them than things by onen. So you see that oral is something that is more likely that it would be a problem for him to have truma. And the Gemara continues, Rava Amar Rava says, Below Hanach Nefisha Nami Lo Matzes Amrit. Even without saying that there are more things listed by Orel than by Onen, still, you can't say that it's going to be Onen over Orel. Shavkinon Arelos T'chsiv Begufei de Pesach. We're not going to leave aside Orel, which is actually written by Karban Pesach, that it's a problem for an Orel to have Karban Pesach. So we're not going to leave that one aside, V'alfinon Aninos Mi Pesach, and then learn out Onen from Pesach, when Onen even by Pesach is not written explicitly. The Pesach Gufei Mi Meiser Gamrino, like Rashi said, the fact that an Onen cannot have Karban Pesach, that's really learned from Meiser. That's not actually written explicitly by Karban Pesach, so therefore it makes more sense to learn Orel and say just like an Orel cannot have Karban Pesach, so to an Orel is not allowed to have Truma. But the Gemara continues, Ima Pesach, but if you're learning from Karban Pesach to Truma, so the halacha by Pesach, as we mentioned above, is Mila Zechar V'Avodim Ma'akeves, that the bris milah of the males and the servants in the family is Ma'akev. And that means to say it's not only Ma'akev the servants and the males, it's even Ma'akev the balabayas of the family, that if he didn't have them circumcised, he can't have Karban Pesach. We should say the same thing by Truma. Af Truma Mila Zechar V'Avodim Ma'akeves. So too by Truma we should say the Mila of the males and the servants should also be Ma'akev, as Rashi over here says. Mila Zechar V'Avodim Im Yeshlo Ben Roy Lomel. Let's say a person has a son that's fit to have a bris milah. Oh, Eved Lomelari, as an Eved that's fit to have a bris milah. Asur Ha'av O Ha'adon Lechol BePesach. The halacha by Karban Pesach is the father, the master, cannot eat Karban Pesach Elim Kein Malu unless there's a bris milah. T'chsiv himo lo kol zachar v'yaz yikra v'gabe Eved ksiv malto so az yochal bo. And so therefore again that should be the same halacha when it comes to truma. And so the Gemara continues, no, to that, Amar Kra, the Pasuk says, Umalta oso az yochal, it says, you give the bris milah, then he can eat from it. And it means to say, Mila zechar v'avodim akeves bo milechol b'pesach, the bris milah to the males in his family and the servants in his family, that holds him back only from eating Karban Pesach. But we darshan, it's only by Karban Pesach. V'ein Mila zechar v'avodim akeves b'truma. But that milah of his zecharim and his avodim does not hold him back from eating truma. But the Gemara says if you're going to make that drasha, if so, you could say the same drasha by Orel in general. It says, Kol Orel lo yochal bo. The Orel can't have the Karban Pesach. Bo eino ochel. You could say the same thing. He can't have Karban Pesach. Avol ochel b'truma, but he could eat truma. And to that, the Gemara says, similar as above, haksiv tosha v'sacher. No, the pasuk has tosha v'sacher, and from there we learn some kind of prohibition. That means the Orel cannot have it. The Gemara says, Umar Isaga, and how do you know which one to include and which one not to include? And the Gemara says, Mistabra makes sense. Arelus de gufe havalei l'rebuye. When it comes to Orel of himself, that he's an Orel, that makes sense to include and say he can't have truma. Again, similar as before, shekain ma'isa begufo v'yonish kares. That's something in his body. That's something that's kares. But the Gemara says on the contrary, adrab, on the contrary, mila zechar v'avodim havalei l'rebuye. Maybe we should include the fact that he can't have it if the zecharim and the avodim don't have bris milah. That's what we should include. Shekain yeshna b'chol shah. That's something that applies all the time. And the Gemara answers just like before, Hanach Nefishan, there are more that apply to an Orel than apply over here by Mila Zechar V'Avodav. And what the Gemara means over here when it says Yeshna B'chol Shah, Mistama, what the Gemara means is it's always possible to have another Zachar, another Eved, so it's always possible to be in this situation. Once again, you can be in this situation where you're required to give them a bris milah, and therefore it's Yeshna B'chol Shah, but again, the Gemara says that's not enough, because there are more qualities when it comes to Orel. And the Gemara continues, if you want, I could say anyway, below Hanach Nefishan, even without saying that there are more things by Orel, but still on Matzah Samrit, you can't say to skip over Orel and go to Mila Zechara Ve'Avodav. Why? Because Mika Midi Da'arelis de Gufe Lo Ma'akvabe doesn't make sense to say that if he would be an Orel, it's not a problem, he can have the Truma, but Arelis Da'acharini Ma'akvabe, but if other people in his family are Orel, then all of a sudden he can't have Truma. That wouldn't make any sense, so it makes much more sense to say that if he's an Orel, it's a problem by Truma, but if his household has Arelis, that wouldn't necessarily be a problem. problem. And the Gemara continues, Hashda da'amrit bo lidrashu da'asa. Now that you've said that the word bo in general comes as a drasha to exclude, so called ben nechor lo yochal bo lamali. What about when the pasuk says by Karban Pesach that a ben nechor can't eat it? What is the word bo coming for? And the Gemara says bo, the word bo comes to teach us, and we'll continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Ayin Aleph Amud Aleph.